Hi, this is Joseph Labrecque, and this is going to be a basic introductory video to sort of some of the properties of an Edge document, and also some of the basic tooling in Edge and how to use that to create things like shapes and so forth. So what we'll do first is create a new file by clicking Create New on the welcome screen, and this will create a file which is going to have all the properties of whatever the last file we actually modified in Edge. You can see I have my lessons panel open here. I'm actually going to close that to give me some more real estate to work with. So here we have our stage properties, and we can give the actual stage a name, so I'm just going to call this intro doc. And then we can do things like adjust the stage width and height, and we can lock these two. We can bind them together, or we can modify them separately, as I'm doing right here. So let's make this 320 by 550, and I'll use this color picker to make my stage black. This overflow property here allows you to set the overflow on the actual stage. So if you have objects that go outside of the stage when it's set to visible, you'll actually be able to see those objects. So really it should probably default to hidden. I always set it to hidden myself. You can also set it to scroll, in which case it's going to always render scroll bars, or auto, and in that case it'll render scroll bars automatically when it needs to. But I always choose hidden for the stage because I see the stage as sort of like a little window. You shouldn't really see anything going on between, you know, the house frame, right? And then you can choose autoplay on or off. And this is in reference to this main stage timeline, and I always keep that on. Composition ID is probably something you're not going to want to deal with. It just needs to be a unique ID for any particular document, so I always keep this as the generated ID that Edge gives us. The rest of this has to do with publish settings, and we don't really need to deal with it right now. So some of the tools to note, the basic tools here, we've got our selection tool, we've got our transform tool, clipping tool I'm not going to talk about here, rectangle tool, rounded rectangle tool, and text tool. Text tool I'm also not going to talk about. Then we have some basic swatches here for background and border color. So if I choose the rectangle tool, and you can see when I hover over any of these corners here, we get these nice guides. So I'm going to use that to actually pull out a rectangle. And this rectangle here is given the name of rectangle, which that's fine. You can call it whatever you want. And it's of type div. This little doohickey here allows us to add actions and events and things like that. We're not going to do that right now. But here we have the display. So we can choose on, off, or always on. And if you choose on and off, this is something that can be managed through the timeline if you're animating things. Or it can also be managed, of course, through actions, so through JavaScript. We have the location and size of the object. So notice I have the selection tool here, and if I move this around with the selection tool, that the XY position actually modifies. So you can see that happening as I move it around. And also as I change the size, these width and height parameters also adjust. Any of these can actually be adjusted right here, and you can see that these are linked right now. I can unlink those if I want to. And the X and Y position can also be adjusted in this way. Here's my opacity slider. So if I want to make it fully transparent or fully opaque, I can do that. Each particular rectangle element also has an overflow property. So visible, hidden, scroll, etc. So this comes into play for nesting other elements within this rectangle. We have here the background color and border color. And we also have a border width and a border style. So if I choose here maybe a solid border, and let's make that red 15 pixels. And I can also change this to green if I want to. Green looks kind of hideous, so maybe I'll use this yellow color. So you'll notice also that when I do this, it changes these little kind of default swatches up here. Some of the other bits, we have the transform, origin, rotation, skew and scale. So all of these can be actually done also through the transform tool. So if I choose the transform tool, you'll notice that we have a number of different objects actually overlaid on our rectangle here. So we have this registration point, which we can adjust if we want to, and you can see it's changing the transform origin point. So we can also adjust this here. And you'll notice that you can actually have this transform origin point be outside of the rectangle itself, which can cause some interesting effects. We can rotate through this dialog here. We can also rotate when I hover over the edges here, the corners. We can rotate that way on the stage if we wish. And then we have skew controls, so being able to skew, and also scale. So scale is actually a transform control. You'll notice that even though I'm changing the actual dimensions of my object, it's not changing the size, really. It's changing the actual scale of the object. And you'll notice here too that sometimes these things get linked. So changing the scale will change the size. But basically, if you want to change anything in this transform portion, you use the transform tool. And if you want to change anything in this upper portion here, you will use the default selection tool. We're also able to change the cursor, and this is upon hover. So if we want to maybe change it to a pointer, we can do that. And then when we actually publish this, it'll render a pointer when we hover over the object. So popping back over to the transform tool, we can see these little diamonds here, and these allow us to actually adjust the corner radii. And we can also actually adjust these separately. If we hold down Control on Windows and probably Command or something like that on a Mac, we can actually adjust those separately, or we can do it from in here as well. So if I go and turn on one corner, so that allows us to do them all the same, they're all linked, or 4, so I have adjustment over 4 particular corner radii, or even 8. So this makes for some really precise corner manipulation. We also have clipping, but we won't really talk about that right now, since we're not talking about the clipping tool. So any elements on our stage are going to show up also in the Elements panel. So if I choose the Rounded Rectangle tool, and I draw out a new element, you'll notice that it takes on a lot of the properties of this previous element. And the reason it does that is because we're actually using the Rounded Rectangle tool. Instead of thinking it as rounded rectangle versus non-rounded rectangle, it's sometimes easier to think of this as the rounded rectangle tool as preserving many of the properties, including the corner radii settings, from whatever the last object you drew out on the stage. These tools actually create the exact same type of object in Edge. And we can see that all of my rectangles are now represented over in my Elements panel here. So this has been a quick example of how to adjust properties of the stage when working in Edge document, and also how to kind of draw out and manipulate things using the rectangle, rounded rectangle, selection, and transform tools inside of Edge.